January 17th, 1945. Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. A cold, grey morning. Snow covered the barbed wire, and the air was so sharp it burned their lungs. These German women had crossed oceans, survived bombed cities, and rationed every crumb of food. They expected hunger, harsh orders, maybe even cruelty. But what they found shocked them completely. A mess hall full of warmth, the hiss of steam from kettles, and the clatter of trays carrying something they could barely recognize. The smell hit them first. Soft, fresh biscuits drenched in creamy white gravy. For women used to black bread and thin soups, it felt like a dream or a trick. Could this really be for them? Could an enemy treat them like this? Their first bite would change everything they thought they knew about war, fear, and kindness. Watch the full story to see what happened next. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and support our channel for more incredible, true World War II stories. The German women arrived in America tired, hungry, and unsure of what would happen next. Many had been captured in North Africa, taken from radio units, medical teams, or clerical groups. They were not hardened soldiers, but they had lived under a system that taught them one lesson very clearly. An enemy never shows kindness. As the train doors opened at Fort McCoy, the cold Wisconsin air rushed in sharp and heavy. Some women pulled their thin coats tighter. Others stared at the snow, surprised by how clean and quiet everything looked. Most had spent the final months of the war in Europe surrounded by shortages. Food lines stretched for blocks. Families survived on small rations measured in grams. Diaries from that winter often mentioned the same things. We are always hungry, or bread must be saved for the children. One former radio operator later wrote that by 1944, meals in Germany felt more like memories than real food. So when these women crossed the ocean to the United States, they expected the same or worse: punishment, starvation, and suspicion. Instead, the first thing they noticed was order. Trucks moved steadily across the camp roads. Guards spoke calmly, using gestures more than shouts. The buildings were plain but well kept, with smoke rising gently from chimneys. For women who had traveled through bombed cities and broken train stations, this place felt strangely unreal. Inside the camp, they were counted, registered, and guided through the gates. One woman whispered to another, "How long until they take our rations?" A guard overheard, but only pointed toward the barracks. Even this small moment confused them. They had been warned that Americans treated prisoners coldly, but here no one seemed eager to scare them. Still, fear stayed with them. They did not know American rules. They did not know if the guards expected strict silence or quick obedience. Every footstep felt heavy as they walked across the frost-covered ground toward their temporary quarters. Someone coughed behind them. Someone else wondered aloud, "Will we get food today?" The question hung in the air because none of them knew the answer. What they did know were the stories. Rumors had spread through German units. American camps were harsh, food was limited, and women would face harsher discipline than men. These warnings traveled across languages and borders, shaping the expectations of thousands. Many prisoners repeated the same line: "Do not trust the enemy, they will break you through hunger." But when they reached the barracks, something unexpected waited for them: warmth. The heaters inside hummed softly. Blankets were stacked on bunks. The air smelled faintly of soap and wood, not fear. One of the women would later recall, "It felt wrong to relax, as if someone might shout at us for it." This moment of mixed feelings, fear, relief, and uncertainty, became the emotional starting point for their new reality. They had arrived expecting the worst, but already small details challenged everything they thought they knew. Outside, the snow kept falling in slow, white flakes. Inside, they tried to understand the strange truth forming around them. America was not acting like the enemy they had been taught to imagine. Soon, the next quiet surprise would come from a place none of them expected: the dining hall. The first time the German women walked toward the American mess hall, they moved slowly, unsure if they were even allowed inside. A bell rang across the camp, metal and clear in the cold air. Dozens of prisoners stepped out of their barracks, forming lines without being pushed or shouted at. This surprised the women immediately. In Europe, food distribution had become tense and chaotic. Here, everything felt calm, almost too calm. As they reached the building, warm air drifted through the open doorway. It carried smells they did not recognize, something buttery, something rich, something warm enough to cut through the winter wind. One woman whispered, "It smells good," almost as if she expected someone to correct her. Another stared at the steam rising from inside and said softly, "Is this really for us?" Inside, the hall was bright and organized. Wooden tables were cleaned, metal trays stacked neatly, and American cooks moved with quick, practiced steps. The sounds were steady, pans clanging, ladles scraping pots, boots sliding across the floor. For women who had spent months hearing only distant explosions or rushed footsteps through damaged buildings, these ordinary kitchen sounds felt strange and comforting at the same time. They watched the American soldiers finishing their breakfast. Plates carried soft bread-like pieces covered in a thick white sauce. The women had never seen anything like it. German breakfasts were usually simple. Rye bread, a little butter, maybe a slice of cold meat if it was available. A warm breakfast with heavy sauce and soft bread was completely outside their experience. The cooks, noticing the women lingering near the doorway, exchanged confused glances. Finally, a guard walked over and said, "Go on, there is food." His voice was calm, almost friendly, but the women still hesitated. They had been warned that asking for more food could lead to punishment. They didn't want to make a mistake. One woman, braver than the rest, stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, nearly a whisper. "Are there leftovers?" The guard blinked in surprise. To him, leftovers simply meant food that hadn't been taken yet. But to the women, leftovers meant hope, something that might still be allowed after soldiers finished eating. He smiled and repeated, "Yes. You can have some. You'll like it." His casual kindness created another moment of confusion. The women looked at each other, unsure if they correctly understood him. But the smell of the food pulled them forward. As they lifted the trays, the warmth spread through their hands. They followed the line, watching cooks scoop scrambled eggs, oatmeal, and the mysterious biscuits covered in thick white gravy. A few women exchanged nervous glances. One whispered, "Is it sweet? Is it salty?" Another said, "Maybe it is for dessert." None of them could guess the taste from the look alone. When they finally sat down, the benches creaked beneath them. The hall felt too open, too safe, and too strange all at once. They touched the biscuits with their forks, testing the texture. It was soft, almost doughy, nothing like German bread. The gravy smelled peppery, creamy, and unfamiliar. One woman leaned closer and said, "It looks like paste." Another replied, "If it is food, we should try. We cannot refuse." Hunger pushed them forward, even if fear still made their hands shake. What they didn't know was that this moment, this simple meal in a bright hall far from home, would become one of the clearest memories of their captivity. They had not yet taken a bite, but already the experience challenged their expectations. And the true shock would come with the taste. The first bites came slowly, almost painfully slow, as if each woman feared she might be doing something wrong. A few closed their eyes before tasting the strange, white-covered biscuits. Others held their forks in mid-air, hesitating, waiting to see who would be brave enough to try it first. Hunger finally made the decision for them. The first woman to taste it later described the moment simply, "I expected nothing. Then I tasted everything." The biscuit was warm and soft, not dry or hard like the dark rye they were used to. The gravy was thick, salty, creamy, and full of tiny pieces of sausage. For women who had survived on thin soups and small bread slices, the richness was overwhelming. Their expressions changed instantly. Cautious eyes widened, shoulders loosened, and silent confusion turned into quiet surprise. One woman whispered, "This is good," as if asking permission to enjoy it. Another took a larger bite and covered her mouth, shocked by how filling it felt. They looked at each other, searching for reassurance. They found it in the growing smiles and the sound of forks scraping against metal trays. The cooks noticed their reactions and exchanged amused looks. One of them, a young American from Tennessee, later recalled, "They looked like they didn't trust their own taste buds." He watched as the women took careful, polite bites at first, then quicker, more confident ones. Within minutes, the biscuits were gone. The gravy smeared on the edges of the plates was all that remained. What made biscuits and gravy so surprising was not just the taste, it was the weight of it, thick, heavy, and warm enough to feel like it settled deep inside the stomach. German food in the final years of the war had become thin and stretched. In 1944, the average German civilian ration dropped to as low as 1,200 calories per day, sometimes less. In comparison, American soldiers in POW camps were regularly served meals totaling around 3,000 calories. The difference was not just physical, it was emotional. For these women, each bite carried a message they couldn't quite understand yet. This wasn't the cruelty they had been warned about. One woman, a former nurse, murmured, "Why would they feed us like this? We are the enemy." Her friend answered softly, "Maybe they don't see us the way we were told they would." After finishing their plates, the women hesitated again. Asking for more felt dangerous. In German-controlled territories during the war, prisoners could be punished simply for asking extra food. But hunger and curiosity worked together. One woman stood up, her tray empty, and approached a cook. Her words were quiet, almost apologetic. "Excuse me? Could I have a little more?" The cook didn't hesitate. He scooped another portion of biscuits and gravy onto her tray and said, "Of course. Go ahead." The woman froze. She wasn't sure if it was a trick. Only when the cook nodded calmly did she return to the table. The others stared, waiting to see if something bad would happen. When nothing did, more women stood and asked for seconds. By the end of the meal, the tension in the hall had softened. Their fear wasn't gone, but something new had appeared beside it, a small sense of safety. They still didn't understand American rules or why the food was so generous, but they now knew one thing clearly. Their ideas about American treatment were not matching reality. The biscuits and gravy didn't just fill their stomachs, they opened a door, a quiet, simple door, into a world that didn't behave like an enemy. And soon they would learn why this difference existed. The meal raised a new question in the minds of the German women. How was this possible? How could a country at war serve prisoners food richer than what many civilians in Europe could find for their own families? To understand the shock of that first breakfast, the women had to understand the world behind it. A world built on numbers, resources, and systems very different from what they had known. During the final years of World War II, Germany struggled with collapsing supply lines. Farms had lost workers to the front, railroads were damaged by Allied bombing, rations dropped lower every few months. Statistics from 1944 showed that an adult in Germany often received less than half the calories needed for healthy living. Many meals were simple, thin soups, rationed bread, small potatoes when available. Even soldiers sometimes wrote home asking for food. In contrast, the United States was producing more food than at any other point in its history. American farms expanded to nearly 380 million acres of active production. Factories processed thousands of tons of canned goods every week. A single American wheat harvest in 1943 produced more grain than some countries had grown in an entire decade. Even after feeding soldiers, sailors, and millions of civilians, there were still mountains of surplus. This difference shaped life inside POW camps. The US Army followed clear rules from the Geneva Convention, which required feeding prisoners meals equal in quantity to those given to American soldiers. At many camps, guards even joked that prisoners often ate better than they did. Reports from 1945 recorded that an average POW in the United States received around 3,000 calories per day, more than double what many German civilians lived on. The German women did not know these numbers, but they felt the effects immediately. Food in the camp was steady, predictable, and surprisingly varied. scrambled eggs in the morning, oatmeal that stuck to the spoon, biscuits and gravy on good days, coffee so strong it left a bitter smell in the hall long after breakfast ended. The women had never seen morning meals prepared in such large amounts. The steam rising from the kitchen carried the smell of pepper, cooked oats, and frying sausage. One woman later wrote in her diary, "It felt as if America had food everywhere, not just enough, more than enough." Another noted that she had never seen so many metal cans of milk or crates of flour stacked one on top of another. The scale alone was shocking, but beyond the numbers there was something deeper happening. The routine of regular meals slowly changed the way the women saw their captors. The first few days they still ate with stiffness in their shoulders, expecting someone to step in and correct them. Yet nothing happened. No one shouted if they took an extra spoonful. No one punished them for finishing their plates too quickly. The camp ran on structure, not fear. Because food arrived reliably each day, the women learned to breathe differently. Their bodies relaxed. Their hands moved with less hesitation. Even their conversations changed. Breakfast became a moment of quiet relief, a time when the cold outside felt distant and the war felt a little further away. Still, the contrast remained almost unbelievable. How could one side of the war face constant shortages while the other had enough to feed prisoners well? This question stayed with them, shaping their understanding of the world far beyond the camp fences. And soon, the voices of those who lived through these moments would reveal even more about how deeply this surprise touched them. The women slowly settled into life inside the American camp, but each day still felt unreal. They walked through the gates as prisoners, yet nothing around them looked or felt like the punishment they once feared. Instead of harsh commands, the guards spoke in calm voices. Instead of cold, dark rooms, the women slept in wooden barracks warmed by sunlight during the day. Their new world was confusing, but it was also safe, something many had not felt for years. One morning, the women were taken to a small medical building. They expected quick inspections or rough questioning. Instead, American nurses greeted them with simple kindness. The nurses checked their wounds, treated infections, and gave them clean bandages. Some women had not seen proper medical care since the early years of the war. A few were embarrassed by their condition, but the nurses did not react with judgment. They just worked quietly, focused on helping. For many German women, this moment was the first time they understood how different American ideas about prisoners were. These nurses were caring for them the same way they cared for their own soldiers. The women whispered among themselves as they left the building, still unsure how to process what they had experienced. Some felt relief, others felt guilt, and some simply felt lost. Food also became a daily reminder of their new environment. The meals were simple: beans, bread, potatoes, soup. But they were filling, warm, and served on time. Hunger was no longer an enemy. After years of war shortages, these consistent meals felt almost luxurious. One woman quietly admitted that she had not eaten this well since before the conflict began. Another wiped away tears as she tasted fresh fruit for the first time in months. The Americans expected the prisoners to work, but only within their abilities. They cleaned camp areas, helped in the kitchen, or worked in small workshops. These tasks were not punishment. They were routine duties that gave structure to the day. The guards supervised, but from a distance. Conversations were possible. Small jokes were shared. Over time, the atmosphere became more human than hostile. Some guards even taught the women English words. They practiced simple phrases like "good morning," "thank you," and "work finished." The women answered with German words in return. These exchanges did not erase the realities of war, but they softened the space between two sides that had once seen each other only as enemies. As weeks passed, the women learned more about American life. They noticed how local women walked freely near the camp without fear or strict control. They saw newspapers with stories that criticized politicians openly, something impossible back home. They heard radio programs filled with music, humor, and lively discussions. These small glimpses showed a society where voices were not silenced and where daily life was not shaped by constant propaganda. At night, the women often talked quietly in their bunks. They discussed how different everything was from what they had been told. They remembered the warnings from Nazi officers who claimed that Americans were brutal and treated prisoners like animals. Now they realized those stories had been lies meant to frighten them. The truth they were living was completely opposite. Still, the women felt a deep tension. They were grateful for the humane treatment, yet they knew they were still far from home. They did not know how long they would stay in this camp or what awaited them when the war ended. Some feared returning to a destroyed homeland. Others wondered whether their families had survived. Hope and fear blended together in their minds, creating a quiet weight that followed them each day. But one thing was now certain. Their understanding of the world had changed. The American camp had challenged everything they thought they knew about enemies, freedom, and the meaning of humanity in wartime. As spring turned into summer, the women slowly developed a routine inside the camp. Life was still restricted, but it began to follow a pattern they could understand. Each morning, the bell rang, and they stepped outside for roll call. The air was cool, the ground slightly damp, and the guards stood quietly with their clipboards. No shouting, no threats, just a simple count to make sure everyone was safe and accounted for. After roll call, the women went to the dining hall. The building smelled of bread and boiling coffee, a scent that reminded many of calmer days before the war. The American cooks moved quickly behind long counters, serving plates with the same energy they used for their own soldiers. Some prisoners nodded politely, still unsure how friendly they were allowed to be. Others whispered soft thank yous in English, hoping the pronunciation was correct. Work assignments filled the next hours. Some women were sent to the laundry room, where steam rose from metal tubs and clean clothes hung in neat rows. Others worked in small vegetable gardens that the camp used for extra food. A few helped in areas where basic repairs were needed. The tasks were not heavy, and the guards did not rush them. The goal was simply to keep the camp organized, but the real changes happened during the quiet moments, those brief pauses when the women could step away from their duties and simply observe. They saw American women outside the camp riding bicycles, carrying shopping bags, or chatting freely with friends. Their clothing was simple but practical. Their movements were relaxed, as if the war had not pressed on their lives in the same crushing way. For many German POW women, this sight was powerful. Back home, life under the Nazi regime had grown more controlled each year. Conversations were watched, opinions were monitored, people learned to hide their thoughts. Here, in the United States, everyday life seemed open and unguarded. Differences were discussed without fear. Mistakes were not punished with terror. The women felt as if they were witnessing a different kind of world, one shaped by trust instead of fear. Inside the camp, even newspapers offered an unexpected lesson. Some guards left copies behind after reading them, and the women studied the pages with curiosity. They saw reports criticizing the government, questioning military decisions, and debating public issues. This level of open disagreement was shocking. It showed that Americans could challenge authority without being labeled as enemies of the state. One evening, after the sun dipped behind the horizon, the camp held a small movie screening. The projector flickered as it played a simple comedy film. The women laughed at jokes they barely understood, letting the sound of happiness replace the constant tension they had carried for years. For a short time, the war felt far away. Yet even in these peaceful moments, a shadow remained. The women worried about what the future held. Rumors spread through the barracks the war might be ending soon. Some whispered about surrender, others feared what would happen to their families. They wondered whether Germany would still be recognizable by the time they returned. They pictured ruined streets, empty homes, and loved ones lost in the chaos. At night, many struggled to sleep. The beds were comfortable compared to what they had known during the final months of the war, but their minds were restless. They replayed memories of air raids, hunger, and the long journey that brought them here. Even as they adjusted to camp life, trauma from the past still shaped their thoughts. Still, something remarkable was happening. The women were slowly rebuilding their sense of identity. They were no longer only prisoners or victims of a collapsing empire. In the safety of the camp, they found moments where they could breathe, think, and even hope. The simple acts of reading, gardening, or learning new words helped them feel human again. As days continued, they also formed quiet friendships. They shared stories in whispers after work, traded small items, and comforted one another when fear returned. These bonds became essential, helping them survive the uncertainty of each new day. What none of them knew was that the next major change in their lives was approaching, a moment that would reshape their future and reveal a truth they never expected. Days passed quietly, but an unusual tension slowly grew inside the camp. The guards moved with more urgency, and the officers held longer meetings in their offices. Even the American cooks whispered among themselves. Something was happening beyond the fences, something bigger than the daily routines the women had grown used to. One warm afternoon, the women were gathered outside after finishing their work duties. The sky was bright, and the sound of distant radios carried through the open windows of the guard towers. Suddenly, the radios began to broadcast the same message across the camp. The tone of the announcement was serious, steady, and clear. Germany had surrendered. The women froze. Some lowered their tools, others covered their mouths. For a moment, the camp grew completely silent. The war, the force that had controlled every part of their lives, was officially over. Most women did not know how to react. Part of them felt relief. Another part felt fear. Their homeland had collapsed, and everything familiar was now uncertain. They wondered if their families had survived the last months of fighting. They wondered what waited for them on the other side of the ocean. And most of all, they wondered what the Americans planned to do with prisoners, now that the war had ended. Later that evening, the prisoners were brought to the main yard for an announcement. A senior American officer stood before them. He spoke slowly, knowing that English was still difficult for many of the women. He explained that the war in Europe was finished. The fighting had stopped. The violence had ended. Then he told them something they never expected. They would not be punished. They would not be harmed. And soon they would be sent home. Many women stared at him in disbelief. Everything they had been taught back in Germany, every warning, every rumor had said the opposite. They were told that if captured by Americans, they would face torture or death. Instead, they were hearing promises of safe transport and humane treatment. After the announcement, the women returned to their barracks in deep thought. Some cried quietly into their pillows, releasing emotions they had held inside for years. Others sat together on the floor, sharing small memories of home. Villages, forests, family meals, and life before the war changed everything. In the days that followed, preparations began. The camp staff organized medical checks and paperwork. The women received fresh clothes, simple but clean. Many were given small notebooks to write letters that would be sent ahead to their families, letting them know they were alive. But the biggest surprise came during the final days before departure. The Americans arranged small lessons for the women, talks about what had happened in Europe, the truth about the Nazi regime, and the suffering it had caused across the continent. The women listened with wide, stunned eyes. Some had believed the propaganda they were raised with, others had suspected the truth but feared speaking about it. Now the reality was laid before them openly, without fear or punishment. These sessions shook them deeply. They understood, maybe for the first time, why the world had fought so hard. They understood why the Americans treated them kindly, not because they ignored what Germany had done, but because they separated innocent people from the actions of a regime. This realization struck them harder than any weapon could. They had survived the war, they had survived capture, but now they had to face the truth about their own country. The American kindness no longer felt confusing. It made sense in a new way. The guards were not acting soft. It was cold but refreshing. American officers guided them up the ramp. One officer handed out small envelopes, short notes with information about their destination and what to expect when they arrived. The notes explained that Europe was rebuilding, that many families were displaced, and that the women would need patience and strength for the days ahead. Once on board, the women were led to simple cabins with metal bunks. The rooms were crowded but clean. The ship carried not just German women, but hundreds of POWs from different units and regions. Yet even here, the rules were fair. The crew treated them with respect. Meals were cooked on time. Medical staff checked on those who felt seasick. During the long voyage, the women sat on the deck whenever the weather allowed. They talked about the war with new honesty. They spoke about the lies they had once believed, the fear they had lived under, and the strange relief they felt when they realized their captors were nothing like the monsters they had been warned about. Some women admitted that their time in America had changed their hearts. They did not suddenly agree with everything about American culture, but they understood it in a way they never had before. They had seen freedom up close, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom to question authority. They realized these freedoms shaped the American way of life, and they could see how powerful that was. Others wondered what Germany would look like when they returned. Would their towns still stand? Would their families be alive? Would their country ever be the same? These questions filled the women with worry, but they also carried something new. The belief that life could be different from what they had known. As the ship neared Europe, the coastline slowly appeared through the morning mist. The women felt their hearts tighten. They were home, yet changed forever. They walked down the ramp onto European soil with heavier memories but clearer understanding. They had arrived as prisoners. They returned as witnesses, women who had seen a different side of the world and learned truths their leaders had once hidden from them. The great fairness and responsibility. For many of the German women, this was the most shocking revelation of all. As the day of transport approached, the women stood by the gate with their small bags. Some looked nervous, others hopeful. None of them were the same people who had first stepped into the camp months earlier. They now carried something they could never forget, a new understanding of the world shaped not by fear, but by the truth and by the unexpected kindness of those they once believed were enemies. The morning the women left the camp was cool and quiet. A soft fog rested over the open fields, making the guard towers look like faint shadows in the distance. The women stood in small groups, holding their simple bags and wearing the plain clothes the Americans had issued for travel. No chains, no harsh commands, only calm instructions and gentle reminders to stay close together. As the trucks pulled up, many women looked back at the camp one last time. It had been a place of fear on their first day, but now it held memories of safety, warmth, and unexpected kindness. They remembered the meals that had surprised them, the medical care that had healed them, and the small moments of humanity that changed how they understood their former enemies. When the engines started, the women climbed into the trucks. The seats were wooden and uncomfortable, but they did not complain. Their minds were too full. Some stared out the back, watching the camp disappear slowly behind them. Others looked ahead, thinking about the long journey across the ocean and the uncertainty waiting at home. The convoy moved through small American towns on the way to the port. People stood along the streets watching in silence. A few waved politely. Children pointed curiously. The women felt exposed but not threatened. They had grown used to the idea that Americans could look at them without anger. In fact, many faces showed sympathy, not hatred. At the port, the women saw the large transport ship that would take them back to Europe. It was massive, made of steel, with a wide deck and towering sides. The sound of the waves hitting the hull mixed with the cries of seagulls. For some women, it was the first time they had seen the ocean up close. The sea air, greatest shock of all, was realizing that their enemy had treated them with dignity, even when the war was at its darkest. This was not propaganda. This was reality, one they would remember for the rest of their lives. In the months that followed their return, the women quietly shared what they had seen in America. Their stories often surprised neighbors and families who still carried fear and anger from the war years. The women spoke about warm meals, fair rules, and the simple humanity they received inside a place they expected to be cruel. Little by little, their experiences helped break old beliefs shaped by years of propaganda. They understood now that strength did not always come from power or control. Sometimes it came from kindness, generosity, and respect. They had left Germany as soldiers shaped by a harsh system. They came back as women who had seen another way of living, one built on freedom, fairness, and dignity.